I'd like to begin by joining my colleagues, those of us who are your guests, in thanking the people who organized this conference. We're having a good time, and I am looking forward to my tote bag. The only problem is I brought a tote bag, so I'm going to have to put the tote bag in the tote bag so they'll let me take it on the airplane without charging extra money, for which I will bill the Hauenstein Center. So I'll try to solve that. I'm going to talk about time. John Burke this morning started off talking about time, talking about the cycles that operate within administrations. I'm going to talk about time in a couple of senses. One, in the sense of long-term trends, and the other in the sense of breakpoints within the administration at which things changed. I'm going to talk a lot in general and not very much in specific because I only have 15 minutes, and after all, the subject is the organization and management of the White House and its relations with the cabinet, right? Are we bored yet? I'm not going to give you all the inside scoop on whoever was a deputy press secretary, but try to set it in context. White Houses are not invented from scratch. The literature on the presidency used to almost assume that that was the case, that each White House, each administration was a projection of the psyche of the president and was uniquely somehow that president's creation. There's a lot of truth to that. White Houses do reflect presidents. We've been talking about that this morning, but also White Houses are institutions. Administrations are institutions. The cabinet departments from one administration to another are pretty much the same and do pretty much the same things. Similarly, the organization of the White House and the Executive Office of the Presidency are institutions. So we can talk about the Bush legacy in a couple of senses. First is the legacy you inherit. What came to Bush? What was the context historically in which he established his administration? What did he get from other people, including Bill Clinton, but also his father, Ronald Reagan, and others? And then there's the legacy you pass on. And at the end, I'll try to make a few guesses about what that might be so that people can ask critical questions and make me look silly. 5 trends. 5 of the many one could pick out that Bush inherited that influenced his work. First, centralization of power in the White House and the Office of Management and Budget particularly. Generally, over the past several decades, presidents have sought to pull responsibility for the development of and implementation or supervision of the implementation of public policy into the White House. You've just been hearing a story about that in the national security side. It exists in many areas of public policy. George W. Bush continued, for example, the National Economic Council, one of Bill Clinton's major efforts in the direction of bringing responsibility for policy making into the White House. He got partway there in the area of intelligence. Second, politicization. This goes with centralization. It's a strategy that goes back to Richard Nixon, but was first really successfully implemented by Ronald Reagan, attempting to control the discretion of the permanent bureaucracy or of the departments and agencies that you don't trust by populating them at the top and down through the ranks as much as possible with people who agree with your policies, agree with your philosophy. It's easier for a president who's relatively ideological. We all know what a Reaganite is. We're a little less sure what a George H.W. Bushite might have been. George W. Bush was able to pursue this strategy as well. Third, what my colleague Karen Hult and I have called the standard model of the White House as an organization. We stole the term standard model from physics. It's an effort to seem important. There has become a growing consensus in the Washington community that there's really one best way to organize the White House. There used to be a dialogue between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats, going back to FDR, but especially to Truman, liked White Houses that had very few levels of hierarchy and were populated with generalists and were relatively small and sort of bands of brothers kinds of operations. Republicans liked hierarchy and order and specialization, a kind of bureaucratic notion. It goes back to Eisenhower, whose experience, of course, was in the Army. The two battled it out over time, with Jimmy Carter being the last president to resist at the level of refusing to appoint a White House chief of staff until he'd been president for 2.5 years, at which point he did. Bill Clinton had a chief of staff at the beginning, not a very strong one, but 18 months later he got himself a strong one. Essentially what's happened here is the Republicans won the argument. The White House staff that Barack Obama establishes, if he's following the advice he's getting from everybody, from both parties, from John Burke and the White House Transition Project, he will have a strong chief of staff, and Rahm Emanuel's not going to be anything but that, and he will have a White House that looks a lot like George W. Bush's. It's going to look a lot like Richard Nixon's, because he kind of laid down the template for modern White House organization. Now, that all sounds kind of military, like you're marching through Iraq. The idea of the modern White House organization is something called multiple advocacy. We heard about it this morning. The idea of having strict routines to govern decision-making is not to enhance the authority of the hierarch, the guy on top, but rather to create a process whereby issues that might come to the president for decision are staffed out, are circulated around to all those in the administration who are entitled to know and to participate or might have something useful to say. That includes other people in the White House, it includes people in the EOP, it includes the cabinet. The idea is to get as many good ideas as possible gathered together to report dissents and to let the president have all the information he can possibly use to make decisions. Some presidents would really like, Gerald Ford was an example, really like to have people sit in his office and argue. Other presidents, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, preferred it on paper. George W. Bush is sort of a hybrid of that, in that he doesn't really care too much for arguments, but he doesn't read a lot either. But that's, which simply means you condense things for him and save him time. Bush inherited such an organization. Bush had as his vice president one of Ford's former chiefs of staff, Dick Cheney, had as his Secretary of Defense Ford's other former chief of staff, Don Rumsfeld, and as John said this morning, Andrew Card, his own chief of staff, had been a deputy chief of staff prior to that, under his dad. He knew how to do it. He had a lot of people around him who knew how to do it. Fourth trend, the permanent campaign. This is really interesting, and I could talk for a long time about it, so I won't. The idea here is that increasingly, especially in the media environment we live in now, presidents see governing as an extension of campaigning, as an extension of the same kinds of techniques of self-publicizing, of instant response, of polling and focus grouping, the same kinds of techniques that you use in a campaign.